Hi again. This is Jennifer Weiss with the Climate Action Reserve. Thanks once again for joining us for this webinar, taking an advanced look at subnational action and expectations for COP24, which starts next Monday, December 3rd. For today's webinar, we're excited to welcome speakers from California, Hawaii, Washington, and the UNFCCC. I am trying to advance my screen to show you the agenda. If you could see it, then you would be able to read that we will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the presentations. Feel free to type your questions into the chat box, which you should see on the menu bar, likely to the right of your screen. Type your questions in at any time. If you'd like to review any parts of this webinar after it's over, or if you would like to recommend it to any colleagues, we will have a recording posted online. At the end of the webinar, I'll show a link to where the recording will live. So once again, welcome. It looks like we have participants from across the US and a number from Canada and possibly outside of North America. We're happy to have all of you with us. Now I'll turn it over to Craig Ebert for an official welcome and kickoff to the webinar. Craig is president of the Climate Action Reserve. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Jenny. On behalf of the Climate Action Reserve, I want to take this time to express our pleasure to be able to work with the Climate Registry in hosting the state delegations to COP. We've actually had the privilege of working with the Climate Registry for over a decade now, and we will be taking the state delegations to COP next week. You'll be hearing from a few of the speakers today, and it really is our pleasure to do that. You'll be hearing a little bit about the expectations that a lot of us have for COP24. I think the broad objectives are pretty daunting at this stage. Katowice is supposed to result in the details of the Paris rulebook, and certainly on the heels of the recent IPCC report indicating how far the global community is away from achieving our objectives. We need to figure out how to enhance ambitions. So that will be some of the key items for our discussion at COP24. Let me stop there. Jenny, I'm going to turn it back over to you and let's get going.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Now I'd like to welcome our first guest speaker, Lauren Sanchez. She is the International Policy Director at the California Air Resources Board. She'll be talking to us about the importance of the US subnational presence at COP, California's achievements and outcomes from the Global Climate Action Summit, which just happened this past September, that the state will be highlighting at COP. So over to you, Lauren.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. And another thank you to Craig for everything you are doing to facilitate the state's present at COP. It's obviously a very, very important time for us to be able to be on the ground in Katowice sharing our message. And it's really a pleasure to be joining you this morning. And thank you to all the webinar participants for your interest. Looking forward to the Q&A and discussion later. So I thought since I am the first speaker, I would kind of first tee up what we're expecting and watching within the formal negotiations before spending the bulk of my remarks talking about the fun action that is kind of happening outside of the negotiation rooms and the party-driven process. So the two things that California is watching most closely within the formal UNFCCC process, again, as Craig mentioned, kind of the finalization of the Paris Agreement Work Program or the rule book and the Talanoa dialogue. So firstly on the work program, so the analogy I give people on, the importance of COP this year is back in 2015 when we finalized the Paris Agreement, and I was on Obama's State Department negotiating team back in the day, but we really focused on kind of finalizing the cookie cutter and getting all 197 countries to agree to what the shape of the cookie was that we were to bake. So countries are now headed to Poland this year to really bake that cookie, to agree on the detailed modalities and guidelines of the transparency framework, the nationally determined contributions, and the stocktake process that we will see going forward that really make the agreement functional. One of those articles is of particular importance to California. That's Article 6 on market mechanisms. And so, a number of kind of events and conversations we will be having in and around Poland. We'll be hoping to ensure a successful outcome on Article 6 that will ensure continuity and continued success of California's cap and trade program, which is linked with Quebec, and obviously has international implications that are governed by the UNFCCC as well. And then secondly, on the Talanoa dialogue, so the Talanoa process is an inclusive, transparent process that has happened over the course of the past year, led by the Fijian presidency and now supported by the Polish presidency of the COP. And it's really aimed at taking stock of where we are, progress that we've made since Paris and beforehand. And we're really hoping here in California that, it will lead to trigger an increase in ambition on parts of all parties. For California, I participated in the Talanoa dialogue during the Bonn Intersessional earlier this year in May, and was able to share kind of California's decades of work on this issue, some of the highlights of AB 32 and climate progress that we have been leading here on the West Coast, and hoping to really inspire others countries to in turn increase their own ambition. So that's really, the two kind of highlights that we're watching within the formal negotiations. But as I mentioned, we're primarily focused on what's happening outside of the negotiations. If you were at COP last year in Bonn, COP 23, you might remember as a reaction to President Trump announcing his intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, there was a very robust American subnational presence at COP at the We Are Still In Pavilion. And I'm happy to report that We Are Still In and the U.S. Climate Action Network are again hosting a pavilion called the U.S. Climate Action Center. So California will be participating in a number of events and meetings in and around that center. And I think, the core message for us is California is already facing very severe climate impacts and has been dealing with a federal government that, is not only obstructive to the work that we're trying to do here within the state, but is playing an unhelpful role internationally. And so I think we really want to double down on local leaders from across our country are still committed to cutting carbon pollution, addressing climate change, building resilience. And so California will go to Poland to show the world, that we take our commitments here seriously, all of our binding targets, and are, here to support our international colleagues that might be willing to, take the next step and increase their own climate targets to be in line with the latest science. I think a really important note to highlight here, I think I spent the first half of the year less excited and less optimistic about Poland than I have been recently. As Craig mentioned, the 1.5 degree IPCC report has made it really clear that climate change is an immediate threat. And that, together with the National Climate Assessment that came out last Friday, I think have really changed the narrative here in the U.S. Here in California, we have the pleasure of having the majority of our constituents supportive of action on this issue. But I think we're really starting to see a shift in tide across the country that we will be excited to highlight, on the international stage. I want to highlight one particular event where we will discuss the implications of the U.S. midterms. I know a lot of our international colleagues were watching very closely this November, and although we may have lost Senate seats when you get bogged down in the weeds, there were a number of climate initiatives that maybe suffered at the ballots. I think the overall story is one of progress, one of the blue wave, and we look towards 2019 and 2020 with a lot of optimism for our growing coalition of people that are willing to step up and take bold action on this issue. I think another important kind of message that we will be highlighting at the U.S. Climate Action Center is related to the America's Pledge. effort. This is co-chaired by Michael Bloomberg and Governor Brown, and this year released a report that quantified all of the emission reduction potential across subnationals in the United States that are already part of our coalition or maybe now have an appetite to join. And we were able to find that, within reasonable political constraints and technological constraints, if everyone collectively steps up, we are within striking distance of the US NDC and our reduction that we pledged under Paris. I think that's a really important point, again, for our international counterparts to hear, that even though the headlines coming out of Washington might be discouraging, there is this coalition of bottom-up action that is, has taken over the mantle and is driving progress forward. Similarly, the U.S. Climate Alliance, the bipartisan group of 16 states in Puerto Rico that are all committed to upholding their share of the U.S. NDC, will be hosting a series of events at Poland that are really focused on kind of more technical issues related to work that states are leading on HFCs, natural and working lands, a lot of our collaboration that we're doing across the continent, our North America climate leadership dialogue with Canada and Mexico. And, I think here it's, again, important to point out that Paris was always adopted under the premise that it would have to be implemented at the state and local level. And regardless of the posture of the Trump administration, we are, again, still upholding our end of the bargain and pushing that forward. I know I'm running close to time, so I think I'll just highlight, again, a couple of important developments in California this year that we will be excited to share. Governor Brown signed Senate Bill 100, committing the state to a goal of 100% clean energy by 2045. And on that same day, signed an executive order committing the state to a goal to be carbon neutral by 2045 as well. That goal is economy-wide net zero emissions by mid-century. And I think, important message for California to bring is we now have climate targets that are in line with the latest science and will hopefully keep us below 1.5 degrees. We need our international partners, subnational and national governments, to step up and be on the same level. And then just briefly kind of to highlight the summit. So I know a number of you probably participated or somehow supported the Global Climate Action Summit that the governor co-chaired alongside Mayor Michael Bloomberg, UNFCCC Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa, Anand Mahindra, the UN Youth Envoy Jayasima, and the Chinese Special Representative Xie Zhenhua in September here in San Francisco. So over 5,000 leaders joined us here in the Bay Area, climate entrepreneurs, mayors, governors, business representatives, and activists. And we're all calling for a climate-safe future. The premise of the summit was really to have subnationals bring additional commitments to action. And we were able to gather over 500 bold commitments that we will be highlighting in and around Poland so that national governments feel the confidence and the wind in their sails that their subnationals are already pushing forward on this agenda. So they should feel comfortable increasing their own ambition. I think I'll pause here and pass it off to the next speaker, but I'm looking forward to seeing some of you in Poland and continuing this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I will now introduce our next guest speaker, Hittle. She is the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Coordinator for the state of Hawaii. And I think that was a news presentation. We're getting kind of a bit of breaking news from the Aloha State. The state just held its Climate Change Commission meeting this week, and Anu will be sharing outcomes from that. And I know that the state is issuing a press release. So I'm not sure if we're getting an advance preview or if maybe we're still getting breaking news coming out at the same time as the press release. But over to you, Anu. Anu, I wonder if you might be on mute.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. I'm on so many different speakers and devices that I feel like I'm sitting in a hospital. So hello and aloha, everyone. Thanks for having me on this call, and thank you to the organizers, to Craig, Jennifer, and Amy for having me. Yes, indeed, there is some breaking news, and we're scrambling to put a press release together. But there was already a headline this morning in one of our papers about the fact that our commission is pushing for a price on carbon. And so on Tuesday, the commission, which is a high-level 22-member commission, comprised of the heads of state and county departments and agencies, as well as heads of legislative committees that are relevant to climate change. So we have legislators on the commission as well. They all unanimously voted to issue a statement that says that the commission believes, actually the slide that you're looking at right now is sort of an intro slide to my talk, not the breaking news. So if you want to just move to the second or third slide, which says mitigation strategies agreed upon by the commission. The one after that or before, I'm not sure. That's adaptation. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that one, since it's the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission, I'll just go with mitigation first. And that's the statement that the big overall statement that they put out, which is that they're not exactly agreeing to any specific mechanism that remains to be studied for relevancy in Hawaii. But they did agree to the basic principles that it must be something that's going to change behavior, it's going to be equitable and appropriate for Hawaii, and that it's going to help protect, it'll show how it'll protect the future of Hawaii's children and land. That's what those words mean, keiki and aina. So, so anyway, that's the sort of overarching statement. The commission is relatively new, and I'll just sort of outline really quickly how we fit into the national effort and as part of the Talanoa dialogue. So that first slide, actually, which you had up earlier on the screen. Yeah, so Paris and Paradise. So we've got the Paris commitment sort of outlined on the left-hand side with the Eiffel Tower, and then we've got our own Aloha Tower, which you might recognize from Hawaii 5-0. So, but it's, you know, we're just basically looking at mirroring that agreement at a subnational level. And so the act that created and affirmed the state's commitments to the Paris goals in 2017 is the act that established the Climate Change Commission, and I staffed that commission. It is co-chaired by the Department of Land and Natural Resources and by the Office of Planning. So it has an excellent partnership in that co-chair aspect. So in 2018, last summer, Hawaii also passed a carbon neutral goal by 2045. And so we are obviously looking to figure out, what exactly that means. It's only been a few months since we said that. Now we need to figure out, okay, how do we do it? And that's partly what the commission is working to establish, these contributions for the state of Hawaii. And then finally, there is the state stock take mechanism. And for us, that's what I'm hoping that I can get from COP24 is really how are other states and how are other subnational entities establishing a mechanism and then reporting on it and ratcheting up that ambition. So I'm not sure if you want me to go into any details about what we're doing at the commission level or if there's some other aspects, but maybe we could just quickly go through the adaptation strategies that Hawaii had agreed to, and that's also part of the commission work. So on the adaptation side, for Hawaii, this is important because obviously Hawaii is an island state or many islands, and it's unique in the United States in that way. So in that way, we're actually closer to some of the issues that other island nations face. And we're also in the sort of unique position of being in that situation, but not exactly having access to that kind of funding because we're part of the United States. So we're sort of caught between two worlds. And so for Hawaii, this is a big conversation. How do we deal with sea level rise? We're not talking about sea level rise in 2045. Many Pacific Island nations have talked about this already. And for us, for the state of Hawaii, this is also true. We are seeing the effects of sea level rise right now. So we're seeing inland flooding from sea level rise. We're seeing coastline erosion from sea level rise. We're seeing bigger waves. We're seeing just, more intense storms, hurricanes that have not made landfall recently, but they have a big rain shadow and and they create flash flooding. And so we're seeing all those effects right now. Most of our roads are coastal roads. We're sort of an island, sort of, it's more like a circulatory system rather than a grid system. So one road shuts down and you basically shut down the whole island. And so we're looking at, trying to deal with those issues here. So the state released I'm sorry if there's background noise in my office. We're sort of in an open situation, so I apologize for that. Anyway, it'll just show you that we do a lot of work here, right? One of the things we've tried to do, the state issued a sea level rise report, and the commission adopted it. And to call it just a report is actually doesn't do it justice. It's a really state-of-the-art modeling and information on what effect sea level rise have and will have on the Hawaiian Islands. So it really is a document that is to be used for helping Hawaii deal with adaptation to sea level rise impacts. And counties are just starting to adopt it, and the Climate Commission adopted it last year, as I mentioned. And so now we're pushing that forward on this level, which is the slide that you see up here. So we made the commission made some specific recommendations. We're coming up on a legislative session. The idea is to help prioritize and inform some of those bills that will be proposed. And then the same on the mitigation side. So you could move on to the next slide. And really, I don't have a lot more to add. It's just those are the strategies that was the statement we already looked at. And so if you could just move on to the next one. Yeah, and that was just really the other strategies to support the statement that the commission made, which is basically we would like to target some of these things that would move the needle. So amending some laws that are already on the books. Hawaii has a lot of good laws. They need to be better implemented. And then also looking at the state and county, so public fleets taking the initiative and modernizing parking policies, parking management. These are all things that we've identified as would move the needle here in Hawaii. And then to support all of these things, to develop and undertake this as sort of a public service announcement campaign with our partners. So it's not, the usual dorky state campaign. So, so this is what we're trying to do. All of this has been, we also plug in nationally into the U.S. Climate Alliance. So Hawaii is one of the 17 governors that signed up. And through that alliance, we have we're co-chairing the transportation working group. So those are some of the efforts we're putting forward here in our little state, which won't really move the needle much in terms of mitigation, but we are helping to provide some of those playbooks and a sort of a testing ground or a pilot or demonstration, if you will. So I'll stop here and let you folks go on with the rest of it. If there are questions later, I imagine there'll be some time. So thank you.
Thanks, Anu. And I'm glad that you mentioned the questions because I had wanted to remind everyone that if you do have questions for Lauren or Anu or Reed or Claudio, feel free to type them into the chat box at any time, and we will get to the Q&A after we hear from Claudio. So we will move on, and I would like to introduce our third state speaker. It's Reed Schuler. He is the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and Sustainability to Governor Jay Inslee in the state of Washington. And Reed is going to talk to us more about subnational leadership, especially through the U.S. Climate Alliance, and the messages that Washington, the state of Washington, will be taking to COP. Over to you, Reed.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on the webinar. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to join this webinar, and in particular this group of other presenters, all of whom I've had the opportunity to work with closely, which is great. Lauren and I work together on the State Department negotiations team. Anu and I have had the pleasure of working together with the U.S. Climate Alliance, and Claudio was a wonderful counterpart at the UNFCCC Secretariat during the negotiations. So fun group to get to rejoin. My first COP was a decade ago, and it happened to be another Polish COP in Poznan. So I'm looking forward to my now third Polish winter COP. My first one was with civil society, watching and reporting back home on the progress made at these often sort of abstract feeling international negotiations. Later, I joined the State Department negotiations team during President Obama's administration, and then Secretary John Kerry's staff. And now I work for Governor Jay Inslee of Washington. And so I've had the opportunity to approach this international process from a few different perspectives. And I think I've seen a lot of change over that period of time in the level of recognition that the international process has for all kinds of subnational actions: states, cities, educational institutions, businesses, other nonprofits. And I think it's a really important trend. So first of all, I think that, preaching to the choir here, I think it's critical that all of these groups, all of these kinds of non-federal government actors increasingly take climate change action into their own hands. And the good news is that they are doing so. And California's Global Climate Action Summit was just a wonderful opportunity to showcase the breadth and intensity of that action. And that action is important for a number of probably pretty obvious reasons. First, they can help each of their own countries and the world go farther, faster. Second, we can build more support at home for this action by communicating about the importance of this action, showing the value for each institution of taking that action, and demonstrating that it's doable. And so the more that we collectively do, the broader our outreach to our own local communities to help push for more support for this policy. And finally, negatively, to the extent that there are powerful coalitions within each country working to forward climate action, like our states are doing, these actors are well positioned to step in when national governments step back. And so we've certainly seen that here in the United States, and to some extent, when other countries indicate that there may be backsliding, we've seen some troubling things out of Brazil recently, then hopefully the work that subnational governments and others are doing in those countries can help to temporarily fill that void while there's an absence of leadership at the national level. As Lauren said, we're going into this COP with a particular set of reports really underscoring the urgency of the crisis. And, we have various kinds of reports periodically, but I think that the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees was really sobering for a lot of us. It's just got some extraordinary conclusions reached in a very careful and conservative way by more than 1,000 of the world's best scientists reporting on consensus science. And I've personally spoken to a number of scientists who said, actually, it's worse than that. The scientists are being extraordinarily careful to not say anything that they can't fully justify or that can be picked apart by doubters. And so they're actually giving you stuff that in many ways is more cautious than what's probably going to happen. And so that's a kind of a frightening context on top of it. For those of you who haven't taken a look at the IPCC report or one of the many excellent externally available summaries of the report, I encourage you to do so. It's chock full of terrifying stuff, like at 1.5 degrees C of warming, the world will lose 2/3 of all of our coral reefs. And at 2 degrees Celsius, we will lose more than 99% of remaining coral reefs. So there are some really amazing differences, even just between 1.5 and 2 degrees, not to mention the tragic fact that the world is currently on track to far exceed 2 degrees of warming. And so that adds importance to all of our own efforts to accelerate action now while we still have a chance to reverse these trends, and to do so while bringing enormous benefits in the form of health benefits, economic benefits, and many others to our own communities and institutions. Second, we just last week saw the National Climate Assessment that Lauren also mentioned, and it's also this pretty amazing report put out by the US government federal administration saying climate change is here. We are feeling its impacts definitively, continuing to agree with consensus global science. We are causing climate change and those impacts through our own activities. And the National Climate Assessment does something that's really important, and that helps to communicate what those impacts look like at the regional level. So they help us understand, what does it mean in the Northwest for the acidification of the ocean and our shellfish industry? What does it mean for wildfires in California? What does it mean for flooding in the Southeast? And that's really important for people to be able to see not just these generic kind of global pictures of what climate change looks like, and not just sad, but in some, for many of us, far away impacts like coral reefs, but what does it mean at home? And it's really an amazing thing to have a report like this come out while the president continues to say, oh, it's not a big deal. I think this stuff is overwrought and we're not going to do much about it. It's just a bizarre situation. So second, as Lauren mentioned as well, I think we had a great deal of progress in this last election cycle. And so we are coming into this COP with our subnational actors positioned to tell a really strong story about what is happening at the state level. At least 4 states have new governors who have pledged to commit their states to the U.S. Climate Alliance, and those are Illinois, Michigan, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. A lot of big states with significant emissions profiles, and so that's a real expansion of the Climate Alliance that's likely to happen soon. Several others, including Maine and Nevada, with new governors who have strong commitments to climate action, despite not having said anything explicitly about the U.S. Climate Alliance. And so there's really just this tremendous acceleration of the number of leaders at state level who in the U.S. can do quite a bit on climate action and believe that they will do so. One last bit of context on what's happening with our states is that subnational action, while it's most important that we be taking action directly, it's increasingly networked. And so I'll talk a bit about what Washington is doing, but at least 3 coalitions that I want to mention. One is we work very closely with partners along the West Coast through what we call the Pacific Coast Collaborative, and that includes California, Oregon, Washington State, and British Columbia in Canada, as well as 6 major cities across our region, to ensure that we are working on climate issues that affect us regionally. So we're working together on adaptation along the West Coast. We're working together on electrification of our highways and on reducing carbon from transportation, and a number of other key issues that we can address locally. Second, the U.S. Climate Alliance. This is the signature governor's platform for working together at the state level, at the level of state executives, committed to holding the line on the U.S. target to reduce national emissions under the Paris Agreement. And this was co-founded by Governor Jerry Brown, Governor Andrew Cuomo, and my boss, Governor Jay Inslee of Washington, the day after President Trump made his announcement that the U.S. would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And it's extraordinary how much work is now underway with the U.S. Climate Alliance. And finally, I just want to mention the Under 2 Coalition, which is a massive collaboration of subnational governments around the world committed to really significant decarbonization by the middle of the century. And so you can see that each of our states is working not only to advance efforts within our boundaries, but we're working with partners at a variety of levels. So at the COP, you've already heard a little bit of detail, but I generally think of the COPs as having sort of three levels of what's happening. And so the first is the most formal level, and Claudio in particular is going to get into the details of what's happening at this COP, and that is the formal negotiations. What are the negotiators from each country talking about? What are the key issues? What are the key goals and the key challenges at the COP? And you've heard a bit about the rule book, really continuing to work on hopefully finalizing many of the most important details of how the Paris regime really works. What is the transparency process? How do countries report on the progress that they have achieved toward their targets? How are they reviewed on that progress? And a number of other issues. Second, it's the coming together of a really broad climate community. There's this whole kind of conference, trade show, retreat aspect all rolled into one, where thousands of us from nonprofits, from city governments, from businesses committed to this action are coming together for dialogue and policy exchange, both within and across sectors. And I think that while once dismissed by negotiators as kind of a sideshow, it's actually a really important aspect of the COPs. And third, there's this high-level political momentum that is related to the negotiations, but in some ways separate from it, and that is a mix of leader and minister level participants from countries and subnational governments coming together, understanding in some ways specific, in some ways vague, what the level of climate action is coming out from other countries, where expectations are, and kind of where things are going. And this can feel amorphous, but I think it's actually really important whether the world is on the right track in terms of putting the appropriate amount of pressure on leaders being able to showcase the climate action that they're working on and committing to. And as Lauren also talked about, the Talanoa dialogue is going to be an important formal convening of this part of the process, which is an assessment of where we are and where we can go. Last year, in the wake of President Trump's announcement about his intended withdrawal of the U.S., we had a number of governors there at the COP, including my boss, Governor Inslee, including Governor Brown, two of the three co-chairs of the U.S. Climate Alliance, several other governors as well. This year, we won't have as many folks on the ground. Some of that is due to, to transfer of power back home at the States. Some of it is due to the fact that this year, in some ways, feels like a slightly less critical juncture in time to be showcasing that U.S. subnational action, just given that it's not immediately after that announcement by President Trump, but still important. And so we have a variety of state staff on the ground. And we're going to be having a variety of events showcasing this action continuing to move forward in the U.S., continuing to reassure international partners that despite what's happening at the federal level in the U.S., they have a number of reliable partners on the ground at the state level and with a variety of other institutions who are continuing to make strong progress in moving forward, really inspirational leadership coming out of a number of places. And so we'll be telling that story broadly. We'll also be having a set of focused meetings, state-specific bilats, California, Washington, Hawaii, and others, meeting with other countries to share lessons, best practices, share some political intrigue, multi-party meetings like the North American Climate Dialogue that Lauren also mentioned, this really important initiative between Canada, the U.S. Climate Alliance, and Mexico to carry forward continental cooperation established under President Obama, now lying dormant at the federal level in the U.S., but picked up by our governors. We'll be having staff level work on that. And I think really interesting, we'll be having a series of bilateral meetings with the We Are Still In coalition, this really broad, now more than 3,000 institutions of all different kinds in the U.S. Committed to the Paris Agreement, sort of a cross-sector representation from tribal nations, state governments, private sector, faith groups, with other countries to talk about what the climate movement and climate action looks like in the United States going forward. So I really look forward to all of this work at the COP to continue to tell that subnational story and provide additional momentum in the international process. Look forward to seeing many of you at the COP and look forward to Q&A.
Thanks, Reed. It's interesting and inspiring to hear what the three states are doing and what they're taking to COP. And as all three highlighted, subnational actors play a very critical role in achieving the global goals for reducing emissions. So thank you again to all three of you. We're going to pivot a bit now to what Reed referred to as the first level, the formal negotiations. I'd like to welcome Claudio Forner. He is the team lead on mitigation for the UNFCCC Secretariat, and he is going to give us an overview of the negotiation framework and expectations. And I would like to thank you once again, Claudio, for joining us, because I'm sure it's an extremely hectic time for you. And I also think that it might be late at night for you as well. So thank you.
Thanks to you and to the organizers, and it's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I think that because I don't think that I was intending to get into too much detail, and I know that Reed was asking some of the panelists not to give him a little bit of space to say his things, and now he has said most of the things that I wanted to say. But let me see how I can take it forward, and maybe I can take it on from where he said that the process has changed significantly. That is true. I guess that there is two major forces that have driven these. The first one is the negotiations themselves. After Paris, after this big breakthrough, the negotiations themselves tend to not lessen importance, but the implementation side has become equally important. And the other factor, and that's basically it's what is happening outside. The big response that what we call non-party stakeholders have taken towards climate change, sometimes in response to either push from their governments to do more or the opposite. That happens in any case. I think that what is happening now with the broader set of actions, the broader landscape of action, it's amazing, and this is something that the process has been quite responsive to. I do think that given that the details of the negotiations start becoming less and less important, it is very important now, or what will become more and more relevant for the multilateral process is precisely this information on what's happening on the ground, and what is the ambition from different sectors of society, different countries, different cities. I can tell you that from where I stand, one can really feel the energy that is coming, and definitely is energizing the process a lot. Because I think that in the end, what matters is not whether there's a paragraph saying X or Y. What matters is what people are doing on the ground. What matters is that renewable energy is being pursued, that transport policies are being as well pursued, and this is why I think that processes or bringing the experiences and interest of the states is so important. Just with this slide, I just wanted to let you know what the process. A long time ago, it used to be a lot about negotiations only, about let's try to negotiate the final or ultimate agreement. So after Paris, then implementation started to become more important. So every time that you go to the meetings of the multilateral process, you will be seeing that there's I've added here, or have divided into three main portions. One is the negotiations, the other one is the implementation of the rules, and now this is what we call climate action. The climate action is entirely a process that is informal. The negotiations is entirely formal, and the interesting thing about implementation is that it's starting to be a space where the formal process meets the real economy. So I'll provide a little bit of information on the darker blue ones, the global climate action. I'm sure that you know enough of it. So if we go into the next slide, a little bit about the negotiations. So I would start by saying that the UNFCCC is, you know, it's an agreement. It's a book. It's called framework because it does not provide details of implementation. The UNFCCC basically says we have to fight climate change. You go down to the level of detail by establishing protocols or agreements. The Kyoto Protocol was one of them. What the Kyoto Protocol said is it established commitment periods of 5 years, and it identified commitments individually for Annex 1 countries. Now, the Paris Agreement is similar in that it establishes a global goal that is quantitative, and this is the 2-degree and the 1.5-degree goal. It also links to a trajectory. But as far as specific commitments or quantified commitments go, this is where it stops. Then the rest of the agreement, the text of the agreement is about how or what are the requirements that different countries have to comply with in order to reach the goal. And this is, for example, it establishes the very well-known concept of NDCs, transparency, etc. So at the level of the Paris Agreement, it kind of signals what these components are, but it doesn't say in detail how much they have to operate. So you know, to draw a parallel, now with that Brexit is into fashion, there was a paper that is now being discussed at the level of the Europeans, which is the political agreement. So that's kind of the political agreement of Paris, and then you start to negotiate all the details. However, I would say that the Paris Agreement, according to what I believe, it already has enough detail for countries to move forward. And I say this because the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up instrument, which basically lets parties do whatever they want, but together they have to ensure that they are in line with the 2-degree goal. The details that are being negotiated are huge. They're like 20-something different items with details. I have tried to group them here, biased according to what I think is probably more interesting for you. I guess that the most important, I guess, is transparency, because it's the one that would actually enable the implementation of how countries are reporting their inventories, their progress towards their targets, the efforts of cooperation and support to developing countries. So this is a big chunk, and I would say that the one that is most complex and large. Then we have the global stocktake, which is this process every 5 years in which the multilateral process comes together to take stock, to say where are we, and this relates more to the 2-degree goal. So sorry, to the long temperature goal. They're discussing details as to what sort of information you're going to put in, who's going to undertake this global stocktake, what is going to be the process, what outcomes is going to have, etc. Then you have another set of details about NDCs, about accounting and markets, how you're going to probably translate your ambition into possibly greenhouse gas terms. That this is something that is very controversial, because some countries do not want to have quantitative commitments. However, the word accounting talks to measuring greenhouse gases from a national perspective. Then linked to this is how markets interact with these. Whenever you have transfers, there's the rules that are being negotiated, and there's many other details that are being negotiated in the context of NDCs that may not be that interesting. You have another, and then I just blocked packaged these other, because there's other like 15 other items on compliance, adaptation, and finance that have their own life. But I guess that, as I said, for the context of this webinar, I thought that these were the two most interesting. Probably if you have specific questions about them, I will be able to reply. The next slide, please. Okay, the next slide is the Talanoa dialogue. This is something quite interesting. It's already, as I said, with regards to implementation, there's various processes that the convention takes forward. For example, the what we call the MRV framework is a process by which the reports are considered by the multilateral process. And it's an exchange of views in which each country presents its information and says, this is what I have done. Then countries ask questions, but this is an individual one, so it's country by country. The Talanoa dialogue for some is a precursor to what would be the global stocktake. It originally was meant to be looking forward to the next call for NDCs, which is in 2020. But since the beginning, it kind of turned into a big conversation about everything, about where are we with regards to finance, with adaptation, with impacts. And probably the most useful thing that I've seen is that it has triggered a big conversation around the world, that it's not entirely of parties only. We have over 90 regional events organized in different locations, being in parallel and contributing to the Talanoa dialogue. So it has really triggered a conversation about what are we going to do about climate change. What will happen at the COP is, and I don't know if you have had a chance, we just published the synthesis report, which basically summarizes the substance of what the conversation has been so far, and it brings key messages on what we are expecting to see as an outcome. What will happen is that there's various events, but the central event is ministerial roundtables that on the basis of this report, they're going to be discussing. This is ministers, we have princes, presidents, we have CEOs, mayors, and governors sitting in roundtables to discuss the results of the synthesis. And the synthesis refers, for example, to the fact that we are not on target to meet the 2-degree goal. It talks about impacts. So they're going to be discussing these, and they should be sending political signals as to what should we be doing about this. It is at this stage, it is difficult to say exactly in what form this is going to end, but as a minimum, there's going to be some sort of declaration from the presidents themselves, giving a forward direction to the process. Where do they see, for example, global emissions trajectories? What is going to happen to NDCs and long-term strategies, cooperation? And I don't want to take too long describing the concrete messages, because you would be able to read them already in the synthesis report. The whole idea of this process is, in the absence of a political process that could negotiate some sort of global declaration, you can have the presidents giving these common direction just by providing the declaration and summarizing all the directions that are required through the synthesis report. And this is more or less what we would expect. It is possible as well that some parties are interested in casting some of the messages through a COP decision. I don't know if that's going to happen, or if it happens, how strong that it's going to be. And even if it happens, it's definitely not going to be part of the Talanoa dialogue, but more on the formal negotiations of the COP. I just want to finalize again by what I said at the beginning. In the end, what matters is what states are doing, what companies are doing, what individual and the civil society is doing to address climate change. And I think that as we move forward into the future, this will become more and more important, and definitely the process would be looking more to what they're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudio. So we are to the Q&A session. We only have 3 minutes left. I think that we'll do one quick question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy Holm for closing. The one quick question we will do is for Anu. It's from your presentation, Anu. The question is about the 3.5 SLR XA. Where did that come from? You might be on mute again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. All right, thank you. Yes, thanks for asking about that. It's the 3.2 feet, which is a meter sea level rise exposure area. So we took the 3.2 feet sea level rise from our report on sea level rise vulnerability in Hawaii. So that's the larger document, and I can send a link to that as well. And we've got a viewer tool that also shows the areas that would be affected.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, so that was our one quick question. Like I mentioned, I'm now going to turn it over to Amy Holm. She's the Director of Programs and Operations for the Climate Registry, and Amy is just going to do a closing to this webinar for us. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'll just do a quick thank you to our fabulous speakers, Lauren, Anu, Reed, and Claudio. Really appreciate you taking the time today out of your busy schedule to join us. And what I heard is a mixture of sobering news about what happens in terms of 1.5 versus 2 degrees of climate change, which is very sobering, and some good news in terms of what's happening with actions across the world, and now the great news coming out of Hawaii today. So thank you for that, Anu. I've also hearing again about what is very important, which is the implementation factor. So what's being done on the ground, whether it's in Katowice at COP or in North America or around the world. So it's all very important what everybody is doing to combat climate change. I appreciate everybody joining today, and also want to extend my thanks and appreciation to the Climate Action Reserve for co-hosting not only this webinar with us, but also our delegation to the past COPs and to Katowice this year. So look forward to seeing everybody in Poland within the next week or so. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And as promised, here is the final slide. There's a link to where the recording of this webinar will be. And if you are not going to COP, or if you are and you want to stay updated on social media, here are links to where the Climate Registry and the Climate Action Reserve will be posting updates from on the ground. So thank you once again to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for joining us.